Hello, I'm Guntram Werther, and what we're going to do today is talk about doing a useful, and the emphasis on the word useful, pest analysis. Pest analysis is political, economic, social, and technological analysis. Learning objectives here are first to look at some of the components of the pest analysis, and once we're done with that, I'm going to want to get a little farther and discuss the uses of the pest analysis. These are not what most people think. People naturally integrate across realms. When we live, generally we see the impacts of things on other areas of our lives, yet somehow we don't seem to do this when we're doing assessment. So one of the things I want you to think about is that high and low tech integration happens very naturally in almost all circumstances. The picture here is about the Kenyan elections, and what you have here is some tribal violence that happened during the time, and you have a gentleman talking on a cell phone while holding a bow and arrow. The guy next to him is holding a war club, and that is fairly typical. In other words, certain populations adopt Western technologies and modern technologies for their own ends, and so do we when we get new technologies. This second picture here is GPS being used by another tribal company that is using it to map their lands for a lawsuit against a Western mining company. Just because you're a traditional society doesn't mean you don't understand the legal, political, cultural, and social and technological systems of other societies, and trust me, they use it. Some of these mining companies lose multi-billion-dollar cases that involve decades of time because they didn't understand that going in. So some of the things that we want to deal with then is the fact that everything is and always was connected, and that therefore the basic technological, political, economic, and social advance and the integration of that is something that's happened from the beginning of time. The little caption here says, hey, we've invented fire, we've invented whatever the other one is, and we're pretty much done. Well, of course you're not. In the modern reality, modern business practice deals across all of these realms, and any good company that knows what they're doing certainly has a deep knowledge of the political environment they're in, the technological environment, the social cultural environment they're in, and many, many others. So this is just to look at 4 of those environments that are the topic of the pest. Useful pest is not, and I want to emphasize this, a mere list or description. A lot of my students, when they're told to use a pest or use a pest, merely give me a laundry list of some things that they think are useful, political concepts, economic concepts, and so forth. That's not what this is about. The fact that a country is a democracy or is not a democracy tells you very little, if almost nothing, about how politics works in that society. You can think about this very simply. Doing business in Switzerland is not the same as doing business in Singapore. That's not the same as doing business in Chile, and that's not the same as doing business in the United States or Canada or New Zealand. Each of them are democratic, but they're democratic in different ways. So merely telling me they're democratic doesn't do very much. It's also not disconnected from your goal or theme. A lot of times students will give you a factor, economic factor, social factor, technological factor, but there's no clear connection to what it is they're talking about. They just know they have to plug one of those factors in there to do a pest analysis, and that's not going to be a very good analysis. And then randomly selected or convenient facts are not the ones you want. You want the ones that are important, that are meaningful, and you need to be able to explain to us why they're meaningful, not just something you found very easily while doing a Google search or going to the library or however you got your data. So a pest analysis, to be a useful analysis, is a rather different thing than what I've just described. It's also not a comprehensive list. A lot of times students will say, I'm going to get all the facts. You're not going to get all the facts. There's too many of them. You have to choose, you have to select, you have to be wise in your judgments about which political facts or which economic facts or which social facts are going to impact the company, why that's so and how that's so, rather than trying to become comprehensive. It's also not generic, it's specific. We're talking about a specific firm or a specific organization that is present in a particular context, and it's also not static. Relationships among these elements change, they morph, they shift, they migrate, and they form what we might call syndromes. So all of these things lead you to the conclusion that a pest analysis is not some sort of a laundry list, but a rather more complicated thing that you need to master. And so I want to turn to that a little bit here in that sense. A useful pest analysis is meaningfully applied via context-relevant facts, ideas, concepts, patterns, trends, judgments, and across all 4 of these realms. Of course, there are more realms. There's really no way you're going to do a political or economic analysis and not have to pay attention to law or not have to pay attention to public policy or some other areas that don't narrowly fit into those concepts. But within the realm of what we're doing here, those 4 realms are need to be integrated and applied. One way to talk about this is the way they're embedded, entangled, and emergent within their existing context. It's a fancy way of saying that these things don't just come from nowhere, they don't go any old place. There are particular reasons why particular political events tie to particular economic events, tie to particular social and technological events, and they have what we might call an entangled or emergent nature that you need to understand. Again, if you think this is tough, it is. It's not just a laundry list that many people use. They're useful both for scanning, and what I mean by this is once you sort of know how things work, you can constantly scan the environment for changes in political environments or social environments or economic environments or new technologies that are coming online, and then rethink how those may impact your business or your organization. And they're also useful as integration tools when used in conjunction with other tools. The reason they have to be used in conjunction with other tools is because they don't cover the whole spectrum of what you need to know. Once I've done a political analysis or a social analysis or a technology analysis, I have to then embed that into other kinds of analyses to make that useful. It's not a standalone tool. You can't integrate what you don't understand, and therefore you got some learning to do. In order to become a good political scientist is essentially the work of a lifetime. That field has many, many areas and sub-areas inside of it, and the same is true of economics, sociology, and technology. So you have to study broadly outside your field to even get decent at this kind of a thing. I can't emphasize that enough. I don't care what your major is. Whatever your major is, start reading outside of that major, because that major does not work in isolation. The areas of politics, economics, social change, and technology are certainly fruitful areas, but I'd also think about things like political and economic anthropology, various other kinds of fields such as law that are going to impact your field. The broader you get, the more you're able to integrate. You can't integrate what you don't understand. You study the way things interact and shape each other. These things are not standalone. They shape each other. They interact with each other. And so you have to look at this from a whole systems point of view and understand how those events take place. When you look at sort of the style, if you want to use that word, of how a society or an organization works, that is a distinct style and it's different from other styles, and that's about integration. So when we're looking at politics, economics, society, and technology, it's the interactions, the interrelationships, how they shape and reshape each other that is the primary focus. Again, it's not merely some sort of a laundry list of things that you have to do to get through the class. It's something you need to focus on as a whole system kind of a thing. Few people take the time to do this. Why? Because it's a heck of a lot of work. When you start looking at this kind of thing, it really involves reading outside your field from some certain point in time. In my case, I started reading across 5 or 6 different fields when I was about 10 or 12 years old. I was a weird kid. But you start adding fields to this, and over time you begin to become comfortable in doing comparative analyses across those fields. And it takes time to gain that mastery. We know the timeline on this. Mature mastery seems to occur somewhere around age 35 or so, and that's simply because it takes a long time to do that. Aristotle wouldn't teach politics to people until they were middle-aged. Back in the Greek days, middle-aged was about your 30s because you didn't live much past 40 or 50. Nowadays, cognitive psychologists will tell you that integration, synthesis, those kinds of comparative technologies or techniques mature in individuals around the age of 35 or so. So about the time you're getting a master's degree or PhD, you actually get pretty good at this. It's not something that you're probably going to be very good at 18, 19, or 20. So teams can do a pest analysis, but someone needs to see and understand the whole landscape. You think about this, if one person knows a lot about politics, another person knows something about technology, and the third person knows about society, nothing really makes sense until you sort of see how these fit together and sort of see the landscape. If you can't do that, if somebody doesn't see that, you have a disconnected bunch of pieces that don't give you any useful information at a significant enough level. So what we're focusing on here is how and why things are changing. Understanding why and how politics, economics, or society or technology interacts to produce change is no easy thing. This is the work of a lifetime, and my view is that very few people actually get very good at this kind of a thing. It requires too much thinking, too much work, too much time that isn't obviously connected to a short-term goal. Most people simply don't take that kind of time. The people that do tend to move and see things that other people don't see, and I think that's what mastery is all about. It's a continuing work of a lifetime. You're never done with it. I'm still reading 4 or 5 books at the same time. Now I'll probably keep doing that as long as I'm able. And what you realize as you do this, how little you know about each of these fields. but that's not the game. The game is knowing more than the opposition, knowing more than other people, and coming to better assessments than other people. So even though it's imperfect and it's certainly a work in progress, it continues to make you a better analyst than maybe other people are because you've done this kind of work. So when you get bored mastering just one system, for example, the United States, go on to other systems. Just because you understand the United States doesn't mean you understand Canada. Just because you understand Canada doesn't mean you understand Nicaragua. And because you understand those three doesn't mean you understand China. So this is an endless area of study. I feel fairly comfortable with about 100 systems. I've been doing this since I was 12 years old. This is not something you're going to get in a day. But by studying other systems, you begin to see not only things about your system, but also things about their system, and you start to come to better judgments about what's possible and what's not possible. Trust me, lots of governments and lots of companies miss that. They're very good on certain aspects, but they just don't see how it's going to play out in this particular society. Integrating such learning comparatively across these similar and different systems gives you that kind of information, and that's the kind of information you want. And then finally, they all tie to new realms of learning. You get broader and deeper mastery. When you get broader and deeper mastery, you start getting good at what you're doing. When you look at masters in any particular field, I don't care if it's music or if it's economics or social science, any field, generally the masters are people that are not only deep, but they're also broad. They understand how things work together outside their field and across those fields. Physics and chemistry is easier. I always tell my students that if you go into the social sciences, particularly business, you've picked one of the hardest professions in which to actually make sense of things. One of the things I do in my class is I throw up a marker. Physics, gravity works every single time. If it doesn't, I'm the first guy out of the room. Once you learn the basic rules of physics and chemistry, you have a lot of knowledge, and you can certainly add to that knowledge, but things work pretty much as expected in most circumstances. One of the hardest things you can try to do is to understand complex, adaptive, dynamic social systems, particularly cross-system dynamics or interactions between systems. Think about understanding how the Japanese are doing business with the Americans, and the Americans and Japanese are doing business with the Germans, and you get a basic sense of how complicated that can be. They're all speaking different languages, coming from different perspectives, mindsets, political systems, social systems, and that can get pretty nasty sometimes. So study how they shift, how they morph, and how they change. That's the proper use of a pest analysis. And I want to close down by giving you a couple of slides. The one slide on the one side is the 2-inch snow in Atlanta. That's the traffic jam. And the other slide is what's called Canadian archaeology. It's a typical day in a Canadian winter, and Canadians have adapted to this. They function just fine, even though it takes a while to find your car. So what I'm suggesting for you here is understanding how things work in different contexts, different systems, is a lot more than a laundry list. It's a lot more than just telling me one or two convenient facts about politics, economics, society, or technology. And then understanding those is only a beginning, because that's going to tie into history, philosophy, law, and other areas. Okay, so what we've done here through our little talk is looked at the learning objectives that I hope you'll get from a pest analysis. First, we examined the components of pests. Those are obvious: political, economic, social, and technological change. And second, we discussed the uses of a pest analysis. And what the lesson here is that these things interact, they form syndromes, they form particular patterns, styles of ways of doing business. These change across time and they change across systems. I hope you've thought about that in a useful kind of a way. Again, thank you for your time.